Good evening, we are now live.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vincent Garnier. I'm the Director-General of the FTTH Council Europe, the host of this session today. So welcome to this webinar titled Global Policy and Regulation Review, organized by the Fiber to the Home Global Alliance. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I would like to run through a couple of housekeeping items that will also give time to more attendees to join us. I can see that many of you are still logging in. So very practically, this webinar is recorded, and we will send and share with you a link to the replay, so you'll be able to share that with others and watch again at your leisure. You've accepted to be on the call, so you're likely to receive a communication and invitation to additional events we organize online. We are very happy to take questions, but to do so, you need to use the question box, which is located at the bottom of the control panel you certainly have in front of you. So don't hesitate to use this question box. I will relay your question to the panelists towards the end of the session, and if we are not able to take your question, we'll address that separately. You probably wonder what FCGA mean, and it stands for FTTH Council Global Alliance. It is actually a informal alliance between trade association having in common the objective to promote the acceleration of fiber to the home adoption and rollout across our respective regions. And the alliance is composed of 6 associations, starting with Digital Council Africa, based, I think, headquartered in South Africa and covering sub-Saharan Africa. Fiber Broadband Association, represented here today by Gary, looking after the US and Canada, and with its Latin America chapter, represented by Eduardo, who is covering all the well, the southern part of that big part of the world, Latin American countries. We also have in the network Fiber Network Council APAC for Asia Pacific region, and another similar organization covering Middle East and Northern Africa, Fiber Connect Council MENA. And I'm in charge of the European side of things with FTTH Council Europe. So we're very happy to have you on this session. As a group, we are meeting on a regular basis. We are sharing best practices. We're also working on a couple of projects in common. And today we are very happy to share with you the high-level result of our latest white paper called Global Policy and Regulation Review. And you can directly download this asset from the webinar, from the handouts section on the control box. You can have access to the PDF document, so I encourage you to directly download it. You will also find the document from the website of each of the organizations I've just listed. So don't hesitate to go through that. The objective of the call today is really to enable our panelists to share their comment on the key chapter we are covering in this document. What we wanted to do is to emphasize on something fundamental for the development of FTTH network throughout Europe, which is the policy and regulatory framework which set the context for an healthy growth of FTTH deployment. This is what can drive private investment. This is what enables competition between stakeholders and operators, and ultimately facilitate the acceleration of the deployment of fiber in the different regions. So understanding the difference between countries is quite interesting and important for whoever wants to understand the dynamic playing globally for the FTTH market. And with that, I would like to introduce you to our panelists, starting maybe with Franco Accordino. We are very happy to have you on the call. Franco, you're head of unit investment in high capacity network at the European Commission, and you're based in Brussels. So very happy to have you with us.
Good morning, good afternoon. A pleasure.
And Gary Bolton is president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. And you're calling from Alabama, I think.
That's right.
And Eduardo is the one enjoying a nice weather, short leaves and sunny outdoor temperature.
Florida. Yes, thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for invitation, Vincent.
Thank you so much. We had a similar session earlier today with my colleagues from Asia Pacific, from Middle East, and also from South Africa. So we went through a similar discussion, but I think the content will be a little bit adjusted to the reality of the speaker lineup we have today, also the time zone, because it's mostly about maybe comparing the situation between Europe and the situation between with North America and Latin America. So without further ado, let me open the first chapter for today, which concerns legal and regulatory framework. Why? First, and starting with why does it matter? Why is policy and regulation important? The review clearly highlighted the fact that there are a variety of situations and complex regulation framework and policy which govern the deployment of the FTTH network. We see a variety of situations. Some regions like Europe have a overarching and centralized regulatory framework, which is somehow imposed to member states. Other area of the world, and I guess, Eduardo, that will probably be the case you describe for Latin America, are much more scattered, and the situation is extremely diverse country by country. And then you have the case of the US that Gary will comment on. And so the regulatory framework is also dependent on the deployment target and what policymakers want to do, what is their objective. And there again, in the review, we took stock of the variety of situation in the different country concerning how governments set and what type of target is set by government to, or by a political organization, regional organization, to ensure that citizens get access to the highest level of connectivity. So if we open this chapter, I would maybe ask Franco to start by sharing your comment, Franco, on European Commission objective when it comes to bringing high capacity network to the maximum number of European citizens, and what are the key regulatory framework that are put in place to facilitate achieving this target. You're on mute, Franco.
Thank you, Vincent. Indeed, you depicted the European situation very well. I mean, it's not that we are imposing to member states any specific regulatory, regulation or directive or whatever. I mean, it's the way governance works in the Union. It's the Commission that makes proposals, and of course, if they are adopted, voted by the Council on one side, which means the member states themselves, and the Parliament on the other side, then this enters into force. This is, I guess, slightly different than the other regions, but it seems to work somehow. Of course, the starting point 20 years ago in the Union was that we had a number of, big incumbent monopolies all over around, and then we started to liberalize the the market. And of course, this requires, of course, a good deal of regulations, various layers of regulation. For some while, we proceeded kind of with this patchworking, and then at the point in time, we said, okay, we have to harmonize all of these, and we did the European Electronic Communication Code that everyone knows. It's quite a good reference, but of course, there are a number of side also regulations that we do that are actually hooked very well into the code. Two of those we are just working on. We are in the last step before being voted in the coming weeks or few months. Now, of course, starting from the targets that you said, okay, normally we set targets, and we do that every more or less 5 to 10 years. We had the targets for 2010, and we had the target for 2020. You remember Digital Agenda for Europe. Then we had our targets for 2025, the Gigabit Society targets, and now we have a targets for Digital Decade, which means end of this decade, 2030. Concerning fixed connectivity, really, yes, our aim is to really reach a kind of universality for gigabit. So meaning every household in the Union being covered by 5G, by gigabit speed, very high capacity networks, which is let's say a neutral way to say in most of the cases fiber, but of course due to the fact that in Europe we have a different type of geographical situations, very challenging areas to reach on top of the mountain, we of course admit that other technologies can be used to achieve the gigabit targets. Now, if you ask me what are the challenges in all of these, of course, first is, yes, this universality character of these targets could make it very expensive, but public is there also to intervene when necessary. We have plenty of programs for that. There is a big issue, which is perhaps the elephant in the room, the virtual room. And the fact is that the private invest if they see returns. And for the time being, I mean, actually, I remember last year in Madrid, we discussed this very extensively, even in in several of the sessions there. There is a weak demand on people don't recognize, at least here in Europe, the importance of moving to fiber, because fiber would guarantee a lot of properties, symmetry, low latency, etc., which will be absolutely needed for the future application. So if we want to really be ready for the future, we need to go for ultimate technologies, which is fiber. The question is by when and with which money. That is the big problem. So the challenge is there really in Europe, the fact that we have a lot of legacy, and people might still sit in the comfort zones, the operators, to exploit as much as they can their copper-based technologies, cables or VSDL or whatever it is. And therefore, we are there to accompany this process, which will take time, and with due policies and also regulations and of course investment. But we will speak in detail about these in the next rounds.
Well, thank you very much, Franco. Maybe moving to Gary, target, importance of policy making and regulatory framework. What's the situation is in the US?
Well, I mean, it's just an amazing time here in the US for fiber deployment. This past year, we ended up at 51% of the US is now covered with fiber. So we've made great strides in setting another record deployment year, 9 million homes passed in 1 year, beating the previous record the year before at 8.3 million. And so kind of just as I'm sure Franco saw in Europe with the coronavirus, it really kind of emphasized the need for broadband to everybody. And so what we saw a lot of legislation come out of the US and things called the CARES Act, also the American Rescue Plan, which were some initial infrastructure money that went out that really got things going. We had existing programs. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a rural utility service, and RUS, and so that has a reconnect program, and that's been going strong. That's a lot of investment in fiber, and then also the FCC traditionally had some failed programs. One was called the Connect America program, which basically they had speed parameters where it was initially the target was 4 megabits downstream, 1 megabit upstream, and then they subsidized the same areas all over again for 10 megabits, one megabit, and then they subsidized the same areas again for 25 megs down, 3 up. So it kind of just chased the DSL technology iterations. And so they launched something called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which was initially going to be $20 billion. I think about $7 billion got distributed. And then really what's happening now is the what we call the NTIA BEAD program, and this is part of the bipartisan infrastructure law that was President Biden signed into law about 2 years ago. And this is $42.45 billion for critical infrastructure for broadband. And so where that's the priority is on fiber, and so that's where we're seeing a lot of investment in fiber. So if I add all these up, you know, we are seeing about 5x our normal run rate on federal subsidies for broadband right now. And so this is going to add up to somewhere in close to about $100 billion. And then we're also seeing some similar number on private investment, because as we're building up in the US, it's a little bit different than Europe because the regulatory environment favored cable for so long, and cable has dominant market share where it doesn't in Europe. And so the cable operators are now having to upgrade to fiber to compete. You know, with so anything that's on new build, cable's putting out fiber, and anything where there's in competitive areas, they're putting fiber. So the goal of the administration is to have every American to have access to high-speed broadband by the end of the decade. And so we think in the next 5 years, we'll deploy as much fiber as we deployed throughout history, and we'll get largely our way to being able to connect every American with fiber.
And how is defined high speed, Gary, if I may ask? Is it a certain, is it gigabit? Is it, what is the definition? What are we talking about it precisely?
Well, that's a political football. And unfortunately, the politicians like to use speed as a proxy. And so, you know, none of the programs, like for instance, part of the coronavirus investment was something called the Capital Projects Fund that was funded by the U.S. Department of Treasury. So I had Joey Winder this last week on Fire for Breakfast, who is responsible for $10 billion. About $9 billion has already been allocated, another $1 billion left to go. And the speed on that is 100 meg by 100 meg, which is the proxy for fiber. On the bipartisan infrastructure law, and when it got into, you know, basically conference and negotiations, that went from 100 by 100 down to 100 by 20 to help out wireless and cable. And so luckily, NTIA put a hard preference on fiber. And so basically, every project that's going to be for infrastructure has to be fiber unless it's over a extremely high cost threshold. And so every state gets to define what this number is. And so if it's just so ridiculously expensive to reach a home with fiber, they can choose to look at some other technologies. But fortunately, the preference is fiber. And, you know, when we look at the investment, you know, the country is trying to build the critical infrastructure for the future. If I look at the old FCC programs that failed, it was because it was a race to the bottom, because they were, you know, looking at speeds. You know, when they say, okay, 4 megabits by 1, well, that sounded like a lot of broadband back in the day. But, you know, pretty quickly, 4 megabits doesn't do anything for anybody, right? And then when you go to 10 megabits, well, then that, you know, so now that we're, you know, in the US, the primary fiber to home deployment is with XGS-PON, 10 meg symmetric, 10 gig symmetric. And then we've seen 25 gig PON being deployed. Chattanooga is all 25 gig PON. We're seeing AT&T and others deploying 25 gig. And then we're going to get to 50, 100 gig terabits. And so using speed as a proxy is I like to say, one of my friends, Chris Alley, likes to say, broadband's about people. And when it's not, it's about politics. And that's where we kind of get in trouble with the politics.
Okay. Maybe moving to you, Eduardo, how would you address the same question with such a complex sub-region you're looking after?
Yeah, of course. Well, it's good to mention, as you addressed it before, that the dynamics here in the region, we have different approach in terms of regulation and laws regarding telecommunications that varies per country, right? The different approach, all for sure that follows the same goals regarding increasing penetration, deploying cost-efficient infrastructure to connect the population. Nevertheless, we may say that some countries are doing better than others, right? So, which is the standard thing. So I would approach first, would address, sorry, first the momentum in the region, which is pretty aligned with what Gary has described. The momentum in the region has been really interesting the last 4 to 5 years here in the CALA region, despite the macroeconomics and social things happening, continuously in different countries. But the momentum building networks has been really good. We currently have, counting in the last picture we took back in the end of 2022, Latin America has roughly around 111 million of subscribers or household connected to any or to a technology, to a broadband technology, or with a broadband subscription, and half of that, let's say, connection rate is being made by FTTH, right? Which is a good, let's say, market share for FTTH. Nevertheless, we still have a lot of legacy infrastructure. Maybe as our colleague in Europe mentioned, we still having a lot of legacy infrastructure there in the field and need to be, upgraded and moved to fiber. Other import aspect before addressing, the important regulation things in the region being impacted by regulation is households without any FTTH or fixed broadband subscription. We are roughly around 40% of a household in the region still without a broadband connectivity, right? So again, a lot of legacy infrastructure there, a lot of room to grow for penetration. Of course, that maybe from business case perspective, not all of these 40% of areas to be covered are commercially, feasible, but there is when regulation and public-private initiative comes to support that deployment. So in the region, of course, as I mentioned, we have different approaches in terms of regulation and different targets in terms of deployment. We have, for instance, cases like in Brazil, that in 2018 the government launched the National Broadband Plan, right? And they aim to deploy fiber to cover 70% of the households in Brazil by 2023, and this is the plan, right? If we look at our numbers in the panorama, we foresee, because we don't have the final numbers for Brazil, but we foresee that Brazil, for instance, will be above the 70% of a coverage by the end of 2022. It was by the end of 2023. So they are doing quite well because of the ecosystem they have with many tier 3 and 4 players, large T1 and T2 players. So Brazil has a good momentum in terms of FTTH. We have the case of Mexico as well, with the National Digital Strategy, with the goal of deploying 70% of a market. They are a little bit lower, but this goal is set by 2024. We think that they are in a good way to make it happen. Chile is a very mature market in terms of FTTH. A lot of operators and infrastructure are already deployed in the field, and their objective with the current program they have for FTTH is to have by 2025 100% of the population being covered, or the household being covered with fiber optic infrastructure, and they're in a very good way to have this metric accomplished. Just to close, Colombia as well, with the program of the Ministry of Information Technologies and Communication, they have the 70% as goal, the 70% of the household to be connected by 2022. And Argentina doesn't have a, let's say, a goal in terms of penetration, in terms of coverage, but despite, again, the macroeconomic, the social thing happening there and everything, the technology is pushing very hard to move towards fiber, and government has launched through universal funds and other incentives, programs to promote the deployment of fiber. So again, just to close, the situation in Latin America is really good in terms of maturity for emerging economies, as we have in the region, but still a lot of things to be done in terms of deployment to face the, let's say, the full penetration of FTTH in the region.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo. And actually, that offers me an interesting transition to the next part, which is funding and incentive, because we covered targets, objective. You already touched, Gary and yourself, on the importance of funding as being at the core of government policy. I guess the key question around funding is where the money should come from, or if it comes both from private and public, how do we manage the right balance? How do we make sure that public funding is used where it's most efficient? How do you make sure that it doesn't distort competition and maybe make private investor less a bit reluctant to invest? So how do we manage that funding mechanism? Maybe starting with you, Franco, explaining a little bit how things are orchestrated at the EU level, attracting private money, but also using public fund when necessary.
Microphone first. So indeed, thank you for the interesting question, Vincent. We have a general principle that, of course, we let the market developing with its own forces, but of course we are conscious that there are areas, so-called market failure areas, where nobody would invest if the public would not intervene. There are high risks that those populations will remain cut out of the digital transformation, no connectivity, no digital transition. Therefore, of course, we are in general not intervening, so we don't want to crowd out private investments. At the same time, we don't want the private to sit on their comfort zones. So in Europe, we have plenty of measures for that. So first of all, we have the programs. We have the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where a consistent percentage of the fund were devoted by the member states to connectivity, fixed or mobile. We have also included 5G. Of course, we accepted those investments only if they were supporting our common goals, so gigabit connectivity for all households and 5G coverage in all populated areas. We have the European Regional Development Fund, which you have, by the way, mentioned in your report. We have the Agricultural Fund as well. which also allow for investing in rural, very rural areas, with including with the fixed infrastructure like fiber. We have the InvestEU guarantee that is managed by our European Investment Bank, and also all the implementing partners, the national banks, and any other pillar assessed implementing partner. So we really try to complement the efforts that the private sector is already doing. We have a regulation which is conducive to investments by definition. So the code, as I said, is one of the objectives is really to create favorable conditions for investment, for co-investments, etc. Of course, sometimes we have to intervene more or less directly. We have the directly managed programs like the Connecting Europe facility, and we also have our own financial instruments, a form of public-private partnership, where basically we put we as anchor investors the so-called first loss piece, with an overall goal to de-risk the investment. So those investments in infrastructures are typically relatively secure investment with a relatively manageable risk, and with this quite certain returns. But of course, they are more for patient investors. So you need to have a long-term perspective so typically pension funds, of course, they could be interested in that. Actually, in our fund, which is called European Broadband Connecting Europe Broadband Fund, we have put 100 million. We got basically a leverage of 5 to 6 times by putting also investment from the European Investment Bank, 3 national promotional banks and institutions, and the private investors. So it's a very good fundraising, this one, for connectivity, I would say. And those are projects where that by definition can be only in market failure areas, where of course the idea is that the use of the first loss piece by the public, by us, is the function there. I mean, the rationale for that is that it will unlock then in the end the market, and in the end we divest, and of course then the market takes off, even if it is in rural areas, because in the end you can have a lot of use cases, and also included for business use or for supporting service of general interest in those remote areas. So this is basically the quite a wide pool of actions that we do at the European level. Of course, very often the challenge is to coordinate all of this. We have updated recently our state aid rules for broadband, that of course allows sometimes intervening in the presence or the absence, of course, of a proper level of connectivity. For that purpose, we have divided the territory into white spots, gray spots, gray areas, and black areas, just to see when there is a presence of one at least network, or is even planned in the coming years. Then we don't intervene generally if there is 1 or 2, etc. So there are different policies for the different type of areas, and so far it works very well on these. In fact, we see in our annual digital decade report that fiber rollout is progressing relatively well. The big problem that we have is more on the take up, as I said, but that's another story.
Thank you so much, Franco. Gary, you were mentioning very impressive amount of public money being put on the market for fiber deployment. Is it, undiscriminated, or is it channeled towards areas of low density, or that Franco would describe as potentially having a market failure? Can you tell us a bit more about how that money is channeled through to effective operational deployment?
Yeah, so the big money this year is the NTIA BEAD money, and that's broadband equity and deployment money. So that's infrastructure money. So while that was appropriated by Congress and administrated by one of the agencies in Washington, the money flows down to all 50 states and 6 territories, so 56 states and territories. And so the way that money is allocated is based on updated FCC mapping. And so before the FCC maps were a disaster, they were zip code, postal code based. And so if you served one location in a postal code, you were saying the whole area code was covered, which was a disaster. And so now it's location based. So they commissioned CostQuest and done a much better job on that. And so the priority is going to what we call unserved. And the definition of unserved is less than 25 megabits downstream and 3 megabits upstream. And then the secondary priority is on underserved. And that is if you have less than 100 megabits downstream and 25 megabits upstream. And so, or excuse me, 20 megabits upstream. So really gives a lot of opportunity. There's also match, 25% match, letter of credit. There's a lot of parameters in place. The nice thing about the US is that we have a tremendous number of models that have come across. Kind of traditionally you had incumbent operators that had what we call a propensity to spend model. So they would basically put the investment in what we call NFL cities, so places, big cities where people would have a large disposable income. So that was a priority. And so now by being able to, with coronavirus and this whole need for everybody to have broadband, what we've seen is communities step up, saying, hey, we need economic development, we need jobs, we need access to world-class healthcare, education. So all those things that fiber delivers, those communities have stepped up. And so that's like you see someone like Chattanooga, where they use the utility of the community municipal utility, or rural electric co-ops, those utility operators. And then we see a lot of new entrants into the market. So we have a lot of different models, from the tier 1 operators, incumbents, to tier 2 and tier 3, to the electric companies, to community broadband, to new incumbents, the Google Fibers and so forth. So a lot of players. We have about over 1,100 fiber operators across the US. And so it makes it attract a lot of private investment, because if you were able to secure money to serve an unserved community, the people that need it most, as you're trying to get from your existing network to there, you're passing lots of other neighborhoods that might not have fiber. They might have okay service, but they're subject to some other, whether it's a DSL or cable or fixed wireless or something else, and they're able to now fiberize all your way there. The other big area is tribal communities. If we look at we have a committee at Fiber Broadband Association on tribal broadband, and I mistakenly had thought of tribes as like rural, low-income areas. And as they say, if you met one tribe, you met one tribe, and tribal areas are completely different. And there's some unique money for tribal broadband from the government that doesn't require match. So there's lots of ways to kind of put this money together to make it attractive for private investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Franco, you want to say?
Allow me to Gary, because you mentioned interesting, we have similar, type of categories of areas or communities where our rules tell us if we can intervene or not with the public funds. My question to you is if you have any mechanism for surveying with the stakeholder, because even if you have an unserved area, you might have one or two or few operators, including Loga, that might have already an intention or a plan to bring fiber there. How can you make sure that you are aware of this? You must probably have some survey in place. And the second point is a proposal to Vincent, is why we don't try to have then a dedicated session in checking each other, let's say, mapping approaches to mapping and also surveying these kind of things, in whether we can learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you know about mapping is it's never right. So it's a never-ending challenge. So basically, the way that the new FCC mapping, it basically has two components. First is the fabric, where they've identified all the locations, and then the second is service provider data. So all the operators across the nation provide their data on where they're serving, and that's constant. So you can constantly see what areas are being served. There's also a challenge process. So when you go to award areas, then someone who might be planning to deploy there or already deploying can then challenge, saying, hey, I'm already deploying this area, so you don't need to overbuild this. So there's a lot of kind of mechanisms in place to, because as any operator, if they're going to put investment in the area, they don't want someone else coming in and taking away from their market share. So there's mechanisms in place to make sure that everybody knows who's investing in the area, and to make sure that that money is going to areas that are not being invested in.
Thank you. Just want Eduardo to say a few words about financing. Do you say, when we had the session this morning, and I think I quote some of the speakers from Middle East Africa, they were saying that a lot of deployment is very much dependent on company controlled by government, and it's government investment, and not too much relying on market dynamics, so not offering a lot of opportunity for private investors. Do you have similar situation in Latin America, or on the contrary, do you see a lot of private initiative being responsible for the deployment of fiber?
No, I would say that most of the deployment here in the region are conducted by private investment. Okay, I may say that we have this let's say national broadband plans in place in most of the major countries, and with that, let's say the public part of the discussion, they outline some specific goals, and they propose or define funding mechanisms and strategies to explore and expand the broadband access and the broadband market, right? And that's included the FTTH, of course. But basically, the investment is being conducted by the private side of the business. We also have, for sure, for those, as Gary was mentioning, the underserved areas, which is, as I was mentioning before, a big portion of the market to be deployed or upgraded with fiber technology. That a big portion of that big portion is maybe not attractive in terms of commercial, product to be sold in that market. So that's when mechanism of funding from government, from the public side, comes in. And for instance, we have the Universal Service Fund, which basically this money that is financed by telecom operators now, and can be used to subsidize the deployment of broadband infrastructure, right? And we have, for instance, in Argentina, we have the program that is a non-refundable fund, that where you as a private, you present a project for broadband rollout, and that will impact in underserved population. You present a project, and they grant you money to build that infrastructure in a non-refundable approach, right? So but answering your question, the situation here, we have the major operators such as Telefonica, America Mobile, Millicom, Liberty, most of them deploy fiber, and I would say that covers I don't know, maybe 70 to 80% of the market are being covered by private, right? Big players in the private side. We also have other very large operators such as CCTV, Mega Cable, CNT, Entel, I don't know, many others, Telecom Argentina, Many others, the new entrants, I don't know if we will be covering that further, but the new entrants for the regions are the neutral, the neutral operators that are being funded by equity funds or other source of funding, and they're putting money to invest first buying infrastructure and then expanding that infrastructure in fiber to allocate these resources to be rented basically by the operator, right? So again, most of the investment has been made by so far by private here.
Yeah, and I think you offer me a perfect transition, Eduardo. I think we in the program, in the document, in the review, we are also covering things like competition policy, infrastructure sharing, and the other side of the infrastructure sharing is, of course, operator model, some of them being wholesale based, and really offering a service to of fixed infrastructure to ISP, to infrastructure, to information service provider. So that market dynamic is also somehow regulated or operates within a certain framework of regulation. And there are also considerations still in the review around how operator can have access to public assets, and all the question of permitting and making sure that there are not too much administrative hurdles when it comes to having access to a public asset in order to roll out. So I suggest to finish the session that we combine these two topics of how do you ensure a optimize a cooperation / competition between market players to encourage investment, but also to make sure that money is not used for inefficient overbuild, which ends up with too much money being invested for a result which is not necessarily an optimal coverage. And I guess on this question, maybe Eduardo, can you maybe continue to elaborate on the situation in Latin America before I pass the floor to the other speakers?
Yeah, sure, Vincent. Well, of course that the regulatory framework, takes a step here and to cover some interest in the public side, for the user, for the consumer side as well, and of course the promotion of this market liberalization, let's say, is very important in the region. Again, it's a very diverse region in terms of approaches. We do see this major, let's say, just to put an example in the region, we have this what I was mentioning, these neutral operators taking the stage. I mean, in the major economies, let's say Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and with the goal to become the major player in terms of infrastructure, right? With a different, let's say, business model implies a different approach in terms of regulation and conditions. So I may say that the biggest, let's say, or the key aspects to address that are being addressed for these major countries in the region that are promoting, the evolution of this neutral are, again, the market liberalization, right? It's about avoid or take a look on activities or merge that could drive to the monopolization of the market. The other thing is setting the rules and guidelines to promote fair competition, prevent anti competitive behaviors and protect, again, the interest of the consumer. Regarding this anti-competitive practice, this practice include looking at initiatives that could imply predatory pricing, collusion, abuse of a dominant market position, or to vary the new entries to the market, and finally to promote the interconnection and the access to the infrastructure. We have some cases where these the allowances of the infrastructure that has been deployed before for one operator is mandatory. I mean, you have to put that infrastructure available for your competitors, even though you are not your core or your business is not the neutral approach. And in other countries you have this the government facilitating that but not imposing that condition. So again, different and diverse dynamics in the region, but again, I would say that a main character in Latin America, and I was focused maybe more in South America, is a neutral operator and the role that they will take in the future of network.
Okay. Thanks so much, Eduardo. Gary, a similar question. How is competition policy? What is the role of? Do you have infrastructure sharing? And maybe a few words on access to public asset permitting. Is it also something which can be a burden for operators?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of models that are deployed across the U.S. So we do have open access models in certain communities where, like for instance, Utopia Fiber is in like I think 19 communities, and the municipality buys that, puts in the fiber infrastructure, and then ISPs share that infrastructure. And there's a whole bunch of different models of that. It's a really kind of a case-by-case basis based on what works for different communities. But there's nothing that's mandated or, I would say universal. It's, every area is a little bit different, and there's a lot of flexibility. On the area, permitting is a huge issue. So, and I'm sure that Franco will talk to this as well, but we have federal permitting, and there's a lot of work to try to streamline that. There's a lot of legislation in the House, in Congress right now. So Energy and Commerce Committee is working on that. But the problem is that the permitting is also at the state and local levels. And then we also have tribal lands and, land of other areas that, we go over different jurisdictions. So just getting everybody on the same page is very challenging and costly. Same thing goes with right-of-ways and attachments and, the cost that different communities charge to go across right-of-ways. The other area I would highlight is locates. The telecom is probably has the largest loss from not having proper locates, where people backhoe up, whether it's gas pipes or water lines or other damage to, property just from not having proper locates. So we're in the U.S. a huge labor issue, and we just finished a study on fiber deployment costs, and somewhere up to 73% of the cost of fiber deployment is on labor. And so just having qualified fiber optic technicians as well as qualified locators to make sure that you're digging in the right spot and know what's before you dig.
Interesting. Franco, that's also after funding has been concentrating a lot of the attention of the European Union. How can we ensure that deployment is made in the best possible way at the lowest possible cost? How can we lower the barrier, operational difficulty to get the rollout going as fast as possible and as cheaply as possible.
Yes, of course, we have plenty of regulatory actions in the past and also ongoing that are in the pipeline to be updated. So of course, distinguish between the two sides, as you said in the beginning. So we have the gigabit recommendation, which is really providing guidance to the national regulatory authorities, because you must know that networks are regulated at the national level. Of course, there is a kind of a board at European level that is both serving to a little bit to harmonize and coordinate the various NRAs and acting as interface with us, with the Commission. But of course, it's more on the national level that normally those things are regulated. So we are doing a recommendation. So we recommend the national regulatory authorities about the conditions to be imposed on the operator with the strong significant market power. Of course, this is well-defined concept. In order to allow access to their infrastructure. So infrastructure sharing, wholesale models that are already encoded in our main legislation, in the European Electronic Communication Code. They are very much promoted. It doesn't make any sense to have trouble infrastructure, for instance, in market failure rural areas. It would be difficult to explain, but of course, in lively market areas where you have a lot of population, lots of demand, it's normal to have some form of competition also at the infrastructure level. But of course, we are working on now on an update version of our current of our old legislation on the recommendation on the next generation access recommendation. So this is called the gigabit recommendation, which is really updated to fit for the purpose of fiber networks. So in these, we have various remedies that we normally apply to the SMP operators, the dominant operators. Rules for non-discrimination, of course, so ensuring equivalence of treatment of access to these infrastructures, and how to monitor these and to follow up and ensure that indeed it is also applied. Access to civil engineering infrastructures of the SMPs that are somehow obliged to share their data about their own infrastructures. Provisions for, of course, price control and obligations. Typically, we use the WACC as a baseline to see, let's say, the costing methodology, the longer access pricing and volume discount, rewarding on investment risks. So we have a number of methodologies that are really well encoded in this recommendation, which of course we recommend to the member states, alongside of course provisions for the migration to very high capacity networks and fiber in particular, so a copper switch off. So this is one side. The other side is what you mentioned. Okay, what can we do to streamline the deployment? Of course, on this we have really totally brand new, let's say, an update of the broadband cost reduction directive. I think in 2014 now it's again adapted to the new world of 2020-2030, and this is called the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, which is really in the last stages of co-decision. We normally should have it really in weeks or few months, certainly before the end of the mandate. And this is about, of course, regulating access to the physical infrastructure. But here we look, for instance, we have provisions to oblige the public services to make available certain physical infrastructures that are not networks, like for instance a public building, to put fiber inside it, or to put simply a 5G pole on it, because this is of course encompassing not only fixed network but also the mobile networks. So access to existing network infrastructures of other operators under fair, reasonable terms and non-discriminatory conditions, including conditions on price. So we have also provision for streamlining and accelerating the permit granting as well, because it's always a blocking factor or slowing factor on that. So we here, the important thing is the tacit approval, which is a quite controversial point here. So if within 4 months the authority doesn't provide the okay, typically the tacit approval could be triggered. I cannot say will, because it's still formally under discussion. This is the most controversial part. We have also transparency measures, the idea of creating a single information point, a single dashboard where you can go ask whatever you need as a permit, sharing information between the various type of infrastructure, utilities or whatever. So all of these will be part of our forthcoming Gigabit Infrastructure Act. You have seen our proposal, but now this is in the last stages of before being voted. Hopefully soon, where then we can sit together, Gary, Eduardo, and try to map the differences and see how we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Franco. And indeed, we're coming to the end of the session, but the purpose was to give you an overview of what exists in the different regions. It's by definition in 60 minutes is obviously a very high level, but I guess it is also an encouragement for whoever is interested in learning from the experience of the different regions in the globe to go on the website of the different organizations of the Fiber Council Alliance. You have their names in the in the presentation, or you can reach out to any of the association you're familiar with to be put in touch with the other colleagues from the other side of the ocean. I'm sure everyone will do that with pleasure. So I hope you found the session informative and insightful. I would like to thank very much our panel, Gary, Eduardo, Franco. Very much appreciate your comments, your expertise, your insights. And with that, I would like to thank also our audience for having attended the session. I'm sure you will be invited to many other events and opportunity to discuss with your peers around this very interesting topic of FTTH deployment and telecom in general. So thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.